There are no earthquakes here, there are no sudden explosions, and on the surface beneath the blistering sun, nothing looks out of the ordinary at all. But deep beneath the gleaming skyline of Dubai, a relentless and entirely invisible war is being fought. It is a war that does not rely on massive force or catastrophic weather. It relies on something much more patient. Salt water is constantly searching for a gap smaller than a single human hair. When the water evaporates in the intense heat, the salt does not leave with it. It crystallizes inside the very material that is holding this entire metropolis in the sky. Can a single microscopic crystal really generate enough force to threaten the concrete foundations of a mega-luxury city? Why is this hyper-modern oasis fighting an endless battle against its own ancient groundwater? And if the world's best engineers already have the blueprints to fight back, why is the war still far from over? To understand the invisible enemy beneath the luxury hotels and record-breaking towers, we first have to fundamentally change how we look at concrete. When you stand on the pavement of a bustling tourist district in Dubai, the concrete beneath your feet feels entirely solid. It feels like a manufactured rock designed to outlast human lifespans. But this assumption of absolute solidity is the first grand illusion. Concrete is not a singular, impenetrable mass. It is completely riddled with an intricate network of voids, capillary tracts, and microscopic fissures. During the initial construction phase, when cement is mixed with water, a chemical reaction called hydration begins. This reaction gives the building material its immense structural strength. However, not all the water is consumed in this chemical binding process. The excess water eventually slowly evaporates out of the hardened structure. As it leaves, it creates a labyrinth of microscopic tunnels, trailing all the way from the deep interior to the outer surface. These empty capillary pathways remain permanently embedded inside the foundation. Water does not need a large tunnel to travel through a structural wall. It only needs a continuous chain of interconnected microscopic pores. Because concrete possesses millions of these pathways, it acts much like a remarkably slow, highly dense sponge. It possesses a measurable property known as permeability. This means that under the right conditions, moisture from the surrounding environment can and will move through it. If this moisture was purely composed of clean, distilled water, the structural risk would be completely manageable. But the foundation of a modern megacity is rarely soaking in pristine water. In order for this microscopic labyrinth to transform into an active battlefield, it requires a steady supply of dissolved minerals. Dubai did not have to look very far to find this exact chemical cocktail. The city was built directly on top of it. The enemy was already waiting in the geological timeline long before the first steel beam was ever manufactured. But to truly grasp the scale of what the infrastructure is up against, we must map out the battlefield hidden directly beneath the sand. This is not a theoretical phenomenon applied randomly to a famous city just to generate panic. The chemical composition of the ground beneath this specific region has been extensively documented by structural engineers and geologists. A comprehensive hydrochemical study, conducted on the groundwater across Dubai, provides a very clear map of the subsurface reality. Researchers extracted and analyzed 70 different groundwater samples from an unconfined sandy aquifer beneath the urban footprint. They tested these samples across 26 distinct parameters to understand exactly what the foundations were sitting in. The results painted a fascinating and challenging picture of the local geography. As you move from the inland desert regions toward the coastal Sabkha zones, where much of the luxury real estate and tourism infrastructure is concentrated, the water dramatically changes. It shifts from fresh to brackish, and finally to highly saline. Sodium and chloride become the overwhelmingly dominant features in these coastal groundwater zones. The ground itself is saturated with an ancient, highly concentrated saline solution. The local government and building authorities are entirely aware of this reality. The official Dubai Building Code explicitly mandates that geotechnical factors, durability, corrosion protection, and aggressive groundwater conditions must be rigorously evaluated before any foundation is poured. Engineers design these massive underground structures with this exact saline map in mind. They know that the water table is constantly pressing against the concrete retaining walls and deep pile caps. They know that the capillary network inside the concrete is waiting to draw that water inward. But the moment the salt water makes contact with the outer surface of the concrete is actually not the most dangerous part of the cycle. The true physical threat does not occur while the foundation is simply wet. The danger escalates drastically when the water attempts to leave the system. We are about to look at the exact mechanism that turns a dissolved mineral into a microscopic wedge. The first major weapon in this subterranean war is driven by a simple change in the physical state of the environment. Imagine a microscopic capillary pore deep inside a basement wall of a luxury resort. The saline solution from the groundwater has successfully navigated through the outer defenses and filled this tiny void. Because Dubai experiences extreme heat and dry environmental conditions above ground, moisture is constantly being drawn upward and outward toward the surface. As the water evaporates, it leaves the dissolved salts behind inside the pore. The remaining solution becomes incredibly concentrated. Eventually, it reaches a point of supersaturation, and a solid salt crystal begins to form out of the liquid. This is where the science of subsurface forensic engineering becomes truly fascinating. If the crystal was forming on the outside surface of the wall, it would simply grow harmlessly into the empty air. But this crystal is forming inside a confined microscopic space, surrounded by rigid concrete walls. As the crystal continues to grow and expand, it runs out of room. It begins to press directly against the inner walls of the concrete pore. Laboratory experiments observing salt crystallization in confined spaces have measured the exact mechanics of this process. In certain controlled experimental systems, researchers noted that a liquid film of approximately 1.5 nanometers remains trapped between the growing crystal and the pore wall. This infinitesimally thin film allows the crystal to continue drawing nutrients and expanding, pushing harder and harder against the boundaries of its confinement. This process generates what is known as crystallization pressure. We must be very precise with our language here. The crystal does not act like a stick of dynamite that blows up a building in a single afternoon. It does not need to push the entire foundation all at once. It only needs to create extreme localized stress at one microscopic point. When the pressure from the growing crystal exceeds the tensile strength of the concrete surrounding it, a tiny microcrack forms. This crack might only be a few millimeters long, but in the world of molecular engineering, a new crack is a new highway. When the next cycle of moisture enters the concrete, it travels deeper, faster, and carries more salt into the newly created void. It is an infinitely repeating cycle of wetting, drying, crystallization, and microscopic fracturing. Over decades, this localized stress can slowly degrade the surface integrity of the material. But surprisingly, the most visible evidence of this process is often the least dangerous part of the equation. If you walk down into the lower parking levels of certain older structures or look closely at subterranean retaining walls, you might notice a chalky, white powder staining the surface of the concrete. This phenomenon is known as efflorescence. It happens when water travels all the way through the concrete, reaches the air, evaporates, and deposits its salt load right on the visible surface. To an untrained observer, a large white stain looks like a catastrophic structural failure happening in real time. It looks like the building is bleeding salt. However, visual evidence on the surface can be highly deceptive. Visible salt deposits do not automatically prove that the structural core is in critical danger. Efflorescence primarily tells an investigative engineer one simple fact. It confirms that water is successfully moving through the material. The white powder itself is not exerting any pressure because it is growing freely in the open air of the basement. The real threat remains entirely hidden from the naked eye. A visible deposit does not represent a complete structural diagnosis. It is merely a symptom pointing to the active capillary network operating deep inside the wall. The white stain can tell us that water is passing through, but it does not tell us where the most dangerous reaction is truly taking place. To find the real danger, we have to look past the empty voids and travel deeper into the heart of the foundation, where the concrete meets the steel. This brings us to the second and arguably more severe weapon in this silent war. Crystallization pressure causes physical damage to the concrete itself, but another chemical entirely targets the metallic skeleton holding the building together. We must clearly separate these two mechanisms. Salt crystallization and rebar corrosion are not the same chemical reaction. However, the saline groundwater beneath Dubai provides the perfect transport vehicle to deliver both threats into the same environment simultaneously. As the water moves through the capillary network, or the newly formed microcracks, it carries chloride ions with it. The concrete is designed to protect the internal steel reinforcement bars. Under normal circumstances, the highly alkaline environment inside the concrete creates a passive, protective layer around the steel, preventing it from rusting. But as chloride ions slowly migrate deeper into the structure, they eventually reach the depth of the rebar. When the concentration of chloride reaches a critical threshold in the presence of moisture and oxygen, it breaks down that passive protective layer. The steel is now exposed and vulnerable. Localized electrochemical corrosion begins. The rebar slowly starts to rust. This is where the physical reality of materials becomes a massive engineering problem. When steel turns into rust, or iron oxide, its volume expands significantly. The rust physically takes up more space than the original steel bar. Because the steel is completely encased in rigid concrete, this expansion creates immense internal pressure from the inside out. This outward pressure causes the protective concrete cover to crack, spall, and eventually break off entirely in large chunks. These new cracks do not just represent structural damage. They create massive, unobstructed pathways for even more water, more oxygen, and more chloride to reach the remaining steel. A crack is not simply a historical record of an attack that already happened. It instantly becomes an active part of the delivery system to accelerate the next attack. This creates a compounding feedback loop of degradation that can severely shorten the lifespan of a structure if left unchecked. If the chemistry is this aggressive and the water is this abundant, how is the city still standing so tall? The answer lies in the massive human counterattack. We must not fall into the trap of assuming the infrastructure is defenseless. This is not a story of impending doom where the buildings are helplessly waiting to crumble. Modern structural engineers are fully equipped with a highly sophisticated arsenal to fight back. When designing a luxury tower or a massive underground mall in Dubai, the defense strategy is implemented in distinct, overlapping layers. The first line of defense is rigorous geological surveying to understand the exact groundwater chemistry before a single shovel hits the dirt. The second barrier is the concrete mix itself. Engineers specify high-performance, low-permeability concrete designed specifically to minimize the size and connectivity of the capillary pores. They use precise water to cement ratios and special chemical admixtures to make the material as dense as physically possible. The third tactical defense is the concrete cover. They ensure there is a thick, impenetrable layer of high-quality concrete completely surrounding the steel rebar, forcing the chloride to travel a much longer distance before it can cause any harm. The fourth barrier involves heavy-duty external waterproofing membranes wrapped around the entire subterranean foundation. These thick synthetic sheets act as an armor to physically separate the concrete from the wet earth. The fifth layer includes sophisticated subsoil drainage systems and active pumping networks designed to lower the water table and relieve the hydrostatic pressure pushing against the walls. When necessary, they even deploy cathodic protection systems, running a small electrical current through the steel to chemically prevent corrosion from ever starting. The Dubai Building Code enforces these defenses, and major developers spend millions of dollars ensuring they are installed correctly. It is a brilliant, highly engineered fortress designed to hold back the ocean of sand and salt. But an engineered system is only as strong as its smallest imperfection, and every fortress, no matter how well built, eventually has to face the ultimate test of time. This is where the story shifts from a triumph of engineering to a harsh economic reality. An engineer can design a perfectly impermeable foundation on paper. A contractor can build a massive retaining wall that meets every single standard on the day of the grand opening. But no one designs a foundation merely to survive its ribbon-cutting ceremony. The defense system must continue to operate flawlessly under immense pressure for decades. This is where the polished image of a continuously growing luxury city collides with the brutal aging process of its physical assets. Over time, buildings settle and the earth shifts. Construction joints, the tiny seams where one pour of concrete meets another, undergo constant thermal expansion and contraction. A heavy-duty waterproofing membrane, might be accidentally punctured by a single stray piece of rebar during the chaotic construction process. A tiny pocket of poorly vibrated concrete might leave a hidden honeycomb of voids near the surface. Drainage systems can gradually clog with fine silt over the years. The chemical environment of the groundwater can change dynamically due to nearby construction or altered irrigation patterns from massive landscaping projects. Every single one of these common occurrences creates a microscopic vulnerability. Engineers can design against saltwater, but it is incredibly difficult to design against the endless repetition of time. The fortress must stay perfect forever, but the saltwater only has to find one mistake. Once the defense is breached, the cycles of evaporation, crystallization, and chloride transport begin their slow, silent march. This brings us to a critical intersection where microscopic chemistry directly impacts the booming tourism economy. Dubai is currently welcoming record-breaking numbers of international overnight visitors. The tourism boards proudly announce soaring arrival statistics, but record arrivals do not automatically mean that every tourism business is operating without extreme financial pressure. In the hospitality industry, a metric called revenue per available room, or RevPAR, measures the true health of a hotel. While the lobbies are packed and the restaurants are fully booked, the unseen operational costs of the building are steadily rising. A five-star resort cannot afford to have a damp basement, a closed parking garage, or visible structural repairs disrupting the luxury experience. When the foundation's defenses begin to age, the hotel owners must quietly initiate massive, highly expensive maintenance programs. They must inject epoxy resins into structural cracks, reapply expensive waterproofing from the inside, and constantly monitor the steel integrity. These subterranean repair projects require specialized contractors, massive amounts of labor, and significant capital expenditure. The tourists, sleeping in the luxurious suites above, have no idea that a highly funded engineering war is being fought right beneath their beds. The tourism revenue is high, but the cost of maintaining the physical illusion of perfection is quietly eating into the profit margins of the real estate sector. This is the hidden crisis that the brochures never mention. Let us scale this invisible battle up from a single microscopic pore to the entire urban grid. We have traced the journey of one salt crystal, causing a micro-crack. That crack allows chloride to reach one section of steel rebar. That rusting steel causes a chunk of concrete cover to break off. That localized damage forces a luxury hotel to hire a specialized repair crew. Now, multiply that exact scenario across thousands of high-rise towers, sprawling luxury malls, deep transit tunnels, massive artificial islands, and endless miles of coastal retaining walls. The scale of the necessary surveillance and maintenance becomes almost incomprehensible. Not all structures face the exact same level of exposure. The risk varies wildly depending on the specific location, the depth of the foundation, the local soil composition, the original construction quality, and the ongoing operational budget of the building management. A premium tower managed by a wealthy sovereign fund might effortlessly absorb the million-dollar repair bills without missing a beat. But a mid-tier hotel or a residential building managed by a constrained owners association might slowly fall behind on these vital, invisible repairs. When you look at a skyline, you generally judge a building's success by its height and its architectural beauty. But the true longevity and financial viability of that asset might actually be determined by the integrity of a waterproofing detail at a construction joint that nobody has looked at for 20 years. This represents a profound systemic vulnerability. The city is structured to demand endless, rapid growth to sustain its economic model. But the physical infrastructure demands an ever-increasing budget just to stand still and fight off the environment. The economic burden of endless maintenance is a compounding debt. Every new mega-project built into the coastal water table is another massive asset added to the long-term surveillance list. The durability of the city is no longer just a question of whether the buildings will remain standing. It is a much more difficult question of exactly how much money must be continually spent to ensure they remain standing exactly as designed. We have reached the point where we must deliver a verdict on the physical future of this ambitious city. If you came looking for a prophecy of absolute destruction, you will not find it here. There is absolutely no verified data or credible engineering basis to conclude that the entire foundation of Dubai is actively failing or collapsing due to salt crystallization. To claim that the city is doomed to crumble into the sand is a gross exaggeration of the scientific reality. However, the mechanisms of risk are undeniably real, fully documented, and constantly active. In the right conditions, salt water will inevitably infiltrate porous materials. Confined crystals will generate immense localized stress. Chloride will aggressively attack unprotected steel, and structural cracks will constantly provide new pathways for the environment to invade the architecture. The true battle for Dubai is not going to be a dramatic, cinematic disaster. It is a grinding, exhausting, incredibly expensive war of attrition spanning the entire life cycle of the infrastructure. Excellent initial design, high-quality materials, and flawless construction can significantly delay the onset of the infiltration. Rigorous, highly funded long-term maintenance programs can accurately detect and neutralize the chemical attacks before they cause irreversible structural damage. But absolutely no engineering solution in the world allows a building to simply ignore a highly saline environment for the rest of its existence. The answer to our original question is deeply sobering. This is a war that can absolutely be managed, controlled, and fought to a standstill by brilliant engineers and massive capital investment. But it is a war that can never truly be permanently won. Victory in this environment is entirely conditional. It is strictly dependent on every single layer of the defense system continuing to function perfectly, and the financial capital remaining abundant enough to pay for the endless repairs. The illusion of the effortless, maintenance-free luxury city is becoming much harder to maintain. Dubai has always measured its grand ambition by the sheer number of kilometers of new highways, the hundreds of floors in its record-breaking towers, and the dazzling skylines that can be seen from miles away. It is a city engineered to loudly defy the natural limits of the desert. But the ultimate conflict that will decide the true lifespan of these magnificent structures is currently playing out in a dark, silent space, much smaller than a grain of sand. Down in the capillary network of the foundation, there is no dramatic earthquake to warn the residents. There are no flashing red alarms on a control screen to signal a breach. There is only the relentless patience of water, salt, and time, returning to test the exact same microscopic weakness, over and over, cycle after cycle, year after decade. The luxury above ground is a testament to human willpower. The reality below ground is a testament to the uncompromising laws of chemistry. This documentary analysis is based on publicly available engineering principles, scientific studies regarding crystallization pressure, and environmental data concerning groundwater chemistry, available at the time of research. The economic and infrastructural conditions of any city are highly complex and subject to continuous change. This video examines broad structural and systemic mechanisms and is not intended to target, criticize, or disparage any residents, specific businesses, or demographic groups. The structural risks discussed are possibilities based on material science, not guarantees of failure. This content does not constitute financial, investment, real estate, or travel advice. If you value documentaries that look far beyond the polished marketing brochures and uncover the hidden engineering battles beneath our modern cities, please subscribe to the channel. What do you think is a greater threat to a megacity? A sudden, visible disaster, or a slow, invisible process that has decades to find a weakness? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.